They said he was just a grumpy old man with nothing kind to say. He sat in the waiting room like a stubborn shadow, eyes cold, hands shaking. No family, no visitors, just the faint smell of old tobacco and winter coats. But beneath his shirt, tucked close to his chest, hung a pair of worn dog tags. And one nurse, just one, had heard that name before. The clinic in Carson Ridge didn't get much traffic after 6 p.m. Dr. Patel stayed late some nights, mostly catching up on files, while the younger nurses cleaned up and joked quietly about Tinder dates and who forgot to refill the coffee machine. Outside, the wind pushed dry leaves in low spirals across the cracked sidewalk. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed like tired bees. And on that Monday evening in late November, the only patient left in the lobby was the old man in the heavy coat. He sat in the same chair every time he came, third seat from the back wall, directly under the faded poster about hypertension. The plastic of the seat creaked whenever he shifted, which wasn't often. No one called him by name, mostly because he didn't offer it. Grumpy George, the staff called him behind closed doors. He came in twice a month, always mumbling about chest pain or bad knees, then grumbled through the check-in process, left early if the wait was too long, and refused any follow-up calls. But this time, he stayed. He hadn't signed in, just sat there, coat zipped to the neck, worn leather boots tracking in bits of grit from the sidewalk. His hands were folded, not politely, but stiffly, like he was holding something back. His eyes followed no one. A few of the newer nurses avoided him. They said he snapped at them once or called someone useless. The truth was, no one really knew him. That is, until Hannah came on shift. Hannah was 27, newer to the clinic but not new to long hours. Grew up in Carson Ridge, left for nursing school, came back when her dad got sick. Her laugh was soft, her eyes steady, and her grandfather had served in Korea. She recognized things. The way the man sat, upright like a coiled spring, even when tired. The way his boots were laced, the old way, looped through the third eyelet instead of skipping it like modern ones. And the way he wore something under his shirt that hung just below his collarbone. She caught a glimpse of it when he shifted to cough, silver, dull, and swinging lightly from a black cord. Dog tags. Her heart twitched. She wasn't sure why, but something about it made her slow down. "Hey," she said gently, crouching beside his chair. "You okay, sir?" His reply was barely audible. "Fine." She studied his face, deep lines around the eyes, nose slightly crooked like it had been broken decades ago. Clean-shaven, though the stubble came in fast, eyes like cold iron. "Name's George, right?" she asked, though she already knew. He didn't answer. She tried again. "You've been here a few times. I just want to check your chart, see what we can do to help." He didn't look at her. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat and pulled something out. Not the dog tags, a wrinkled, half-torn appointment card. "Lost the other one," he muttered, said to come back. She took it. It was theirs, all right. Date marked in faded ink. "Come on back," she said softly. "We'll get you looked at." He didn't move right away, just stared at her like he was deciding something. Then, with a quiet grunt, he stood. She helped him into an exam room, room 3, the warmest one, and eased him into the chair. The coat came off slowly, with care. Beneath it, the dog tags swung free, and Hannah's breath caught. One name, 2 service numbers, blood type, and a last name she'd heard only once before in her grandfather's stories, spoken late at night over tea and creaking porch swings. Murrow. She stared, not in rudeness, in something like awe. Did you serve with the 38th Infantry?" she asked, carefully, barely above a whisper. He glanced up, sharply. "Who wants to know?" "My granddad," she said, voice soft, "said his life was saved by a guy named Murrow, Korea. They got ambushed outside some rice paddies near Inje." He didn't say anything, just looked at her for a long time. Then one small nod, barely there. And just like that, something shifted in the air. He let her check his vitals, didn't flinch when she asked to roll up his sleeve. His blood pressure was high, but his pulse steady. It wasn't the numbers she remembered. It was the silence. Not tense, not angry, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who's already lived through the loudest things a human can hear. When she stepped out to grab a file, she paused in the hallway. The others were joking again by the coffee station. No one had noticed the old man. But Hannah had, and she was just beginning to understand he wasn't here for the medicine, not really. He was here because it was the only place left that hadn't turned him away. Not yet. The next day, George came back. That alone was unusual enough for Hannah to do a double take as he walked in, slower this time, one hand pressed gently against his lower back. The same coat, same boots, but something was different in his eyes. He gave her a nod, nothing more. No growl, no complaint. And for a man like George Merrow, that was a gesture of trust. Hannah checked him in quietly, without fanfare. She offered him a seat by the window. He took it, still favoring the third-from-the-wall spot, but she noticed how he glanced once at the morning sun filtering through the dusty blinds. She brought him tea, weak but warm. "Don't drink coffee no more," he said. It wasn't a complaint, more like an offering, a breadcrumb. She followed it. "You sleep okay last night?" He shrugged. "Better than some nights, worse than others." She smiled. "That's about as honest an answer as I've ever heard." He gave her a slow glance. A crease softened near his mouth. Could have been the start of a smile, or just the lines in his face relaxing for a moment. By the third visit, he was letting her take his coat before he sat down. By the fifth, she had started keeping his blood pressure readings in a separate folder marked Merrow Confidential, not because it was official, but because it felt sacred somehow. Like this man had been seen, unseen, and now seen again. And by the sixth, he spoke first. "Your grandfather's name was Ellis, wasn't it?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, Ellis Carter." George grunted. Carter wouldn't shut up about his damn harmonica. Hannah laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was suddenly real. The way the past could reach out through an old man's memory and touch the present with such surprising clarity. "He carried it in his sock," she said. George's eyes twitched. "Still remember the song he played when we dug into that cold hilltop? Tennessee Waltz. You could hear it through the damn snow." For a moment, there was nothing but silence in the room. Then he looked away, jaw tightening. He took a bullet in the hip, was bleeding out bad. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "You saved him," she whispered. George didn't answer right away. His hands rubbed together, rough skin on rough skin. "Didn't feel like saving," he muttered. "Just felt like trying." That night, Hannah went home and pulled the shoebox from under her bed, the one with old letters and fading pictures. Her grandfather's handwriting curled gently across yellowed envelopes. Inside, notes from Korea, short ones, barely legible in places. One, folded twice, mentioned a man named Merrow. "If not for Merrow, I wouldn't be writing this. Took one in the shoulder himself getting to me. Never said a word about it after." She read it twice, then again. It wasn't just about George anymore. It was about remembering, about not letting stories like his fade away in the corners of waiting rooms. At the clinic, words started to shift. It wasn't overnight, these things never are. But other nurses stopped calling him Grumpy George. They still didn't know all the details, but they saw how he nodded to Hannah now, how he left the room just a little slower, like maybe he wasn't in such a rush to disappear. One nurse, Sarah, found out he was in the 38th and started reading about it online. Another started asking if George wanted a different seat. He didn't, but he said thank you. The receptionist started printing his appointment cards in larger font without him asking. They weren't big things, but when a man has spent a lifetime being ignored, even small things start to feel like thunder. Then came the Thursday morning that changed everything. George didn't show up. Hannah wasn't panicked at first. Sometimes older patients forgot. Sometimes they just needed rest. But something in her chest, something quiet, told her this was different. By noon, she called the number listed on his file. No answer. At 2:17 p.m., she left work early. She drove past the post office, the town square, the diner where the window always fogged up in winter. She parked near a small two-room apartment over the hardware store. The address George had reluctantly provided 3 weeks prior, after she'd said it was just in case. The hallway smelled like old oil heaters and paint thinner. She knocked. No sound. She knocked again. And just as she was about to leave, the door cracked open. George stood there, eyes hollow. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Hannah reached out without thinking and touched his arm. "You okay?" He opened the door wider. Inside, it was neat, Spartan, no clutter. A single framed photo on the wall. 3 young soldiers in muddy uniforms, arms slung over each other's shoulders. One of them was George. Another, she was almost certain, was her grandfather. A kettle on the stove hummed softly, forgotten. George moved slowly to sit down. He didn't look at her. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. No lock, no name, just smooth, worn pine. He slid it across the table. Inside, a medal, bronze star, 2 ribbons, the dog tags neatly coiled, and a letter, sealed in a plastic sleeve, addressed, "To the family of Ellis Carter." "I never sent it," he said quietly. Didn't know how. Hannah stared at it. Her eyes filled. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're here now." George exhaled, long and slow, like something inside had been waiting to let go for decades. And in that quiet little apartment, with the wind rattling the window frames and the town outside going about its business, a nurse and a veteran sat together in the stillness of everything unsaid, but not forgotten. The next morning at the clinic, Hannah came in early. Earlier than usual, earlier than anyone else. She brought in an old manila folder and a thermos of coffee she knew George wouldn't drink, but brought anyway. It was a quiet offering, like a flag left at a grave. She pinned a note to the break room corkboard. It didn't say much. "Veteran in room 3. Be kind. He's seen more than we know." By 8 a.m., George walked through the front door. He nodded at the receptionist, who, for the first time, smiled and said his name before he reached the counter. And when he got to room 3, it was warm. Someone had finally fixed the heating vent. Someone had replaced the flickering light above the sink. And someone, Hannah, had taped up a small photo in the corner. 3 soldiers, faded and brave. They began something like a routine. He'd come in twice a week now, not just for blood pressure checks, but for conversation. Not that he'd admit that part out loud, but he stayed longer each time. Sometimes he'd bring in old newspaper clippings, folded so tightly the creases made them look like parchment. Once, he showed her a photo of himself, just 22, crouched beside a field radio with wires snaking into the mud. Another day, he came in limping slightly, refused to sit right away. "Just pulled something," he muttered. Hannah didn't push, but she offered to help wrap his ankle. That was the first time he didn't flinch when she touched his hands. They were hands that had done hard things, built things, carried things, held lives and let them go. And now they trembled softly when they reached for a paper cup of water. "You should meet my dad," she said one afternoon. He'd want to thank you for saving his father. George looked down, silent. Then, maybe someday. It wasn't a no. As winter settled on Carson Ridge, the town slowed even further. Snow came early that year, light and dry, clinging to the old brick storefronts and the crooked wooden fences that outlined backyards. George had never decorated for the holidays. Not since the 80s, he said. Too many ghosts. But that year, something changed. He came into the clinic with a tin of cookies, store-bought, sure, but wrapped in red paper. He didn't hand them to anyone in particular, just put them on the front desk and cleared his throat. They're just for whoever wants them. Then he turned and went to room 3. That was the day Hannah decided to do something. She waited until New Year's had passed, until things were quiet again, before the rush of resolutions and cold and flu season. She reached out to the local VFW, quietly, discreetly. She spoke with her dad, then her grandfather's old friend Ray, who still taught Sunday school, and she put together a list of every man in Carson Ridge who'd served, of every man who'd never quite come home, and of the ones who had, but were never seen again. George Merrow was on all 3 lists. One chilly Friday morning, she asked him to stay a little longer after his appointment. "I want to show you something," she said. He grunted. "Is it needles?" She smiled. "No, just some people." When he followed her down the hallway, he noticed the lights had been dimmed, the shades drawn. Voices came from the break room, soft, respectful. When he stepped in, 6 people stood waiting. A few nurses, her dad, Ray, the town librarian, one man in a wheelchair wearing his old airborne touch on a beanie. On the table sat a single candle. Next to it, George's nameplate, printed clean on a folded index card. And beside that, a photo of him and Ellis Carter, the one Hannah had restored from the faded original. No applause, no speeches, just Ray clearing his throat and saying, "We wanted you to know. We remember. We see you now." George stood frozen. Then his shoulders sank, not in defeat, in release. "I never asked for this," he said quietly. "I know, but you deserve it anyway." He looked at her, and in that moment, the grumpy old man from room 3, the one who used to sit silently under the hypertension poster, was no longer a mystery. He was George Merrow, veteran, medic, savior of Ellis Carter, and part of this town again. When he left that day, the receptionist gave him a fresh appointment card, but this one had a note written on the back in soft blue ink. "Room 3 is always yours. H." And as he stepped outside, the wind caught his coat, tugging gently at the edges. He turned back once, just for a second, and then he walked on. But this time, not alone. Snow lingered on Carson Ridge's main street like a thin quilt, seams of gray slush where tires had carved their way to work and school. The morning sun sat low, turning the rooftops a pale gold, and a hush lay over town that felt both fragile and expectant, as though everyone, even the wind, was holding its breath for something gentle to break through the ordinary day. George Merrow shuffled from his apartment shortly after dawn, shoulders hunched, scarf tucked into the collar of that same worn coat. The brisk air caught him hard in the lungs, a reminder of age, but also of those distant Korean mountains where every breath once tasted of frost and gunpowder. He paused at the top of the stairs, steadying himself on the banister, and let the chill settle. Then he descended, slow but sure, toward some place he never thought he'd feel needed again. Inside the clinic, Hannah was already moving between exam rooms, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished linoleum. She'd stayed late the night before, preparing. Not charts or bandages, something else entirely. She'd printed photographs and taped them onto colored poster boards, snapshots of Carson Ridge veterans, past and present. Some were studio portraits, stiffly posed. Others were candid, a laughing private in fatigues, a dusty convoy rolling through sand, a medic cradling a wounded comrade. Beneath each picture, she'd left a line for visitors to write thank you notes. She called it the Quiet Wall. Room 3 stood at the end of the hall, lit by the warm lamp she'd brought from her own living room. A fresh wool blanket, forest green like an old army coat, lay folded over the chair's back. A thermos of weak tea, 2 sugars, waited on the little side table. And in a simple black frame on the counter sat a single page from her grandfather's journal, the paragraph that named George. Next to it, a blank notebook inviting stories from anyone who had ever been helped, guided, or simply witnessed by a veteran. At 8:07 a.m., George arrived. He hesitated in the doorway, eyes narrowing at this unexpected display. For an instant, the old defensiveness surfaced, a lifetime of ducking spotlights and polite applause. But Hannah stepped forward, palms open. "No speeches," she promised, voice calm as snowfall. "Just space. Yours if you want it." George's gaze tracked the photographs, strangers in uniform, some smiling, some solemn, many long gone. He lingered on one shot of 3 fresh-faced soldiers crouched beside a makeshift aid station, a field hotline visible in the background. The middleman, helmet cocked back, was him. "How'd you find that?" he rasped.
"Ray had an old scrapbook," Hannah said. "Asked if I could borrow it." She waited, then added, "Thought you might like to see proof you were young once." A breath that could have been a chuckle slipped from George's lips. He shuffled closer, fingers brushing the frame, as if to confirm the image wouldn't vanish. The clinic smell, antiseptic and coffee, faded behind the thrum of memory. He could almost hear Ellis Carter's harmonica echoing across frozen patties. Hannah reached for the notebook, pen clipped to its cover. "People have written you messages already," she said quietly. "From the VFW, the school, folks who heard your story." George didn't open it. Instead, he lowered himself into the chair, letting the blanket drape across his knees. His hands, those tremor-marked hands, rested on the wool and stilled. For a long time, he simply breathed, steady and measured, as though the room itself were giving him permission to exist without apology. Mid-morning brought the first visitor. Mrs. Alvarez, 8th grade history teacher, knocked timidly on the doorframe. She held a bouquet of paper poppies her students had folded from red construction sheets. Each flower bore a child's scrawled signature. "May I?" she asked. Hannah looked to George. He gave a single nod. Mrs. Alvarez set the bouquet and an empty juice bottle on the windowsill. "We're learning about the Korean War," she explained, cheeks pink. "The kids wanted these to go to someone real." She ducked out, eyes misting. 10 minutes later, the librarian arrived with a first-edition novel about wartime medics, annotated margins revealing George's own field notes. Then came Sarah, one of the nurses who'd once called him Grumpy George. She brought a brand-new stethoscope, not because he needed it, but because she suspected he'd appreciate the precision of its make. She stammered a thank you, squeezed her shoulder, and hurried off, embarrassed by her own tears. By lunch, the quiet wall was filling. Letters, ribbons, small photos of relatives in dress blues. The narrow hallway buzzed with a respectful hush, like a chapel where no one prayed aloud, but every heart spoke. George watched each offering with bewildered humility, not a trace of the old bark or bite, only a dawning awareness that perhaps the world hadn't forgotten him after all. At 1:34 p.m., the hush fractured. A crash sounded from the lobby, glass against tile, followed by a sharp cry. Hannah excused herself and darted out. She found Mr. Watkins, an elderly farmer, sprawled beside a shattered water pitcher, wrist bent unnaturally. The receptionist was pale, uncertain. Hannah knelt, voice gentle, assessing vitals, checking for concussion. Staff converged but hesitated to move him. The clinic's doctor was at lunch across town.
Behind them, George emerged from room 3, blankets still around his waist like a cape. He took in the scene. The panic in the receptionist's eyes, the pain in Watkins' face. Something ancient clicked into place. Training, instinct, purpose. "Splint that wrist," he commanded, voice low but commanding. "Need gauze, pressure here. Keep his head level." His hands no longer trembled. They flew with confidence, rolling Watkins to relieve pressure on the hip, improvising a sling from Hannah's scarf. Staff obeyed without question, as though he wore a uniform again. In 7 minutes, the crisis was controlled. Watkins breathed easier, wrist stabilized, blood flow safe. The ambulance arrived to transport him for x-rays. A paramedic glanced at George's precise work and whistled. "You a doc?" "Just patched bodies once," George muttered, stepping back. But everyone had seen. After the stretcher rolled out, Hannah stood beside him, heart pounding with a mix of worry and admiration. "You're shaking," she said softly. "Adrenaline debt," he replied, surprising her with the clinical term. Then he sank onto the waiting room bench, blankets slipping from his shoulders. The corridor lights hummed overhead, and for a moment the world narrowed to his ragged breath. Hannah knelt. "You did good," she whispered. He lifted weary eyes. Felt like the hill again. Different smell, same sound of bone. She took his hand. "But you were here. You saved him." A slow exhale. "Wasn't sure I could still do it." "You could," she said, squeezing gently. "And you did." News traveled faster than winter gossip. By evening, local radio ran a short piece. 83-year-old Korean War veteran aids injured neighbor at Carson Ridge Clinic. Hannah hadn't called them. Someone, maybe the paramedic, had. George listened on his crackling kitchen radio, alone at his small table. The announcer mispronounced Injay, called him sergeant though he'd been a corporal. It didn't matter. What mattered was the tone, reverent, almost awed, like the town was discovering treasure buried beneath its own feet. That night, he opened the notebook from the quiet wall. His eyes lingered on children's notes, shaky block letters. "Thank you for being brave. My grandpa was in a war too." He traced each word with a fingertip, as if mapping scars made of ink. Then he uncapped the pen and wrote on a fresh page. "To the folks of Carson Ridge, I did what anybody ought to if they can, but your kindness reminds me why we fight in the first place. Thank you for letting an old medic feel useful again. George Marrow." He closed the notebook, exhaled a breath that trembled less than usual, and stared at the candle flickering on his kitchen counter. Outside, snowflakes floated like silent parachutes, settling where they pleased, blanketing even the deepest footprints. George lifted his dog tags from beneath his shirt, held them in the candlelight. They gleamed softly, not bright, but alive. He whispered into the quiet, "Still here, boys." The flame bent, as if nodding. And for the first time in decades, George Marrow felt truly, undeniably home. Spring arrived early in Carson Ridge. The stubborn frost that had clung to fence posts and porch swings melted into soft puddles, and robins began to stitch the air with song again. In the clinic, the window in room 3 stayed cracked just enough to let the breeze in, warm, fragrant, and full of promise. George still came twice a week, but now he had a purpose beyond checkups. He brought clippings from his military scrapbook to add to the quiet wall, and sometimes stories scribbled on lined paper in neat, blocky print. The notebook, once filled by others, now bore more of his own handwriting than anyone else's. One entry read, "There's a photo near the bottom of the board, the one with the 4 soldiers and the broken tank tread. I was there when that tread snapped. Ellis had just cracked a joke about his socks being luckier than the whole damn vehicle. We laughed. Then the shell hit. If you're reading this and wondering how any man walks away from that, the answer is, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you crawl, drag, or get carried. Sometimes you just survive, and that has to be enough. People began stopping by just to read his words. Students, teachers, the mail carrier. One man came from 2 towns over, saying he'd seen George's name in a newsletter and thought maybe they'd served in the same valley. They had. George met each visitor with a nod, a small word, or a story. Always brief, but never meaningless. Then, in early April, George didn't come to his Tuesday appointment. The receptionist noticed first. Hannah tried calling, but the number went to voicemail, the kind of empty-sounding line that made her stomach turn. By noon, she was in her car. The apartment door was unlocked. Inside, it was quiet, not ominous, peaceful. George's coat was draped neatly on the arm of his chair, his boots placed side by the radiator. A note sat folded on the kitchen table. Hannah, if I don't make it to Tuesday, don't panic. I just might be with my boys. Don't let room 3 go empty too long. Someone else will need it now. Thank you. GM.
A soft, dry breeze pushed through the open window. On the wall, the framed photo of the 3 soldiers seemed to watch her. Hannah sat down in the chair across from the note and wept quietly. Not from shock, not from regret, from reverence. Later that evening, when the coroner confirmed that George had passed peacefully in his sleep, warm, safe, and unafraid, the clinic closed early. Not out of sadness, out of respect. The flag from the VFW was brought down Main Street the next morning. Veterans lined the sidewalk. A middle school choir hummed Tennessee Waltz, and Hannah carried George's notebook against her chest like a sacred book. She didn't speak at the small memorial held under the elm tree beside the town's statue of a saluting soldier. But when it was over, she stepped forward. She knelt. She laid his dog tags at the foot of the statue. And then she whispered, so only the breeze could hear. You didn't just survive, George. You mattered. Room 3 remains the warmest in the clinic. A small plaque now hangs just outside the door. George Merrow, medic, veteran, neighbor, remembered. Inside, the wool blanket stays folded over the chair. The framed page from Ellis Carter's journal still rests by the lamp. The quiet wall continues to grow. New stories join old ones, new names, new wounds slowly healing. And in a little black notebook, the one started by a man who once spoke to no one, patients now write messages of their own. One boy wrote, I want to be brave like Mr. George someday. I think he'd understand my kind of quiet. Another, I didn't know anyone saw us, but now I know someone did. Thank you. And among the fading ink and fingerprints, one message always stays etched. We see you now. Thanks for listening to this quiet moment. If it stayed with you, we'd love to have you with us for more stories that honor quiet courage.